by the panel so far, but also in reply to the overarching themes of debate that are likely to arise at this point in time. So now it's your turn. Can I just make one plea when you're making your interventions, apart from the usual one of could you please identify yourself so that the speakers know to whom they're speaking, and which of the speakers in particular you would like to have addressing your question. But the plea is very, very much based on a phrase that came from Robin Palmer's presentation. And that is what we're trying to do here is to ensure that mythologies have a firmer basis in reality. In other words, please simply do not reiterate a mythology, but try to ask questions which are related to the scientific endeavor that lies at the heart of this book, and not simply reiterate a political position. But with those words, please, may I open it up to the floor, and who has the first question?
I think, this question, I think what I've done was just, to get to, 3 key questions that I need to ask Ian, and also to open the floor. I don't take much time to comment. I think it's a very good book. You need to read it, and maybe, get some observations, because I think most, don't know what happened in Zimbabwe, and the comments are a bit, So I think for those who read it, it would be good, to get more comments from the floor. But I think for me, those are the 3 questions that I need to ask, donor support, what exactly, links that actually exist in future, given the past position, and also the links with other forms of land, water, wildlife, what exactly exist given the experience in Masvingo. I think those are the key things that I need to put on it.
Whose ancestors have been evicted? Are there connections there that people are reclaiming land, as it were? And the second one is what types of governance structures have been established in terms of allocating land to particular people, but also managing the types of things that need to be managed amongst people who are neighbours.
I think what I'll do is take questions in batches of 2 at the outset. So a second question, hopefully a related one. Yes, the colleague at the back, please.
Yeah, my name is Andrew Malay, and the question I want to ask is there any systematic differences between land allocation within the rural areas and the urban areas? And it's across the country.
Shall we go now?
Yes.
Okay. Historical claim. As many of you know, Zimbabwe's land reform since 1980 has generally not been associated with a restitution policy as elements of South Africa's land reform have been, very consciously so. But in practice, because of people claiming land, invading land, a lot of those were into areas which were ancestral lands. Now, of course, what's an ancestral land rather depends on your interpretation of which spirits control which bits of land. And, of course, in our study areas, as is the case across the country, there have been a lot of contestations between different chiefly authorities and different spiritual authorities over these new lands. Because, of course, many of these lands weren't used by local people, hadn't been used by local people for a very long time. So it's resulted in actually quite a lot of conflict over who has, as it were, so-called traditional authority over these new lands. But ancestral claims and historical claims have been very much part of it in terms of the local discourse. It's still very much not part of it as far as central government discourse. This is land reform for people, for Zimbabwe. But that's a tension that exists there and has been played out in interesting ways in different places. What types of governance structures have emerged? Certainly in our sites, particularly in the A1 sites, which are the sort of smallholder village-based sites, there's been an interesting transition of governance structures since 2000. When people moved onto the land through land invasions, there were set up through organisations by war veterans. Essentially a set of structures that mirrored occupations during the war and so on. There was base commanders, base camps, committees, so-called committees of 7, which were to manage the new land. But these, rather like the experience in the 1980s, these new structures confronted themselves with traditional leaders. So who was going to be the sabuku, the traditional headman, or the sadunu? Who is the chief? How are the war veterans going to negotiate with spirit mediums who had association with the land? So what one has seen over time is this hybrid negotiation between, as it were, those almost militarized structures that were part of the land invasions to more hybrid forms, which have now started to interact with district land committees and local government. And of course, political structures are in there too. And it's a continuous negotiation, so I can't generalize. I mean, if you look at the book, it's actually very difficult to make a broad picture to that, an answer to that question, because each site, because of the history of the invasion, because of the history of previous occupation, historical claims, is different. And that's proving, actually, for the longer term, a big challenge, and will be an ongoing challenge. The negotiation of authority, state authority, or accepted public authority in these new lands. And how the local government and the state reasserts its authority in these areas in particular ways, beyond the party political assertion, but I'm talking about the state more broadly as a form of public authority that provides services and support, is going to be and remains a big challenge for the future. Is there a systematic difference between land allocation in the rural and urban? We have to. I can't answer that question very easily. Actually, we have to ask Debbie Potts who is here. Who is here? Yeah. You are here. Good. And Debbie, you can answer it.
I had a feeling you were going to do this.
I thought I saw you. I thought you.
The answer is essentially no, because as you know, I mean, there are differentials between the way which land was organised in Zimbabwe in terms of agroecological regions, but overarching all that is the difference between private freehold capitalist land tenure and so-called communal or indigenous tenure, whatever you want to call it. And all the main towns in Zimbabwe and Rhodesia came under the former capitalist formal land tenure, operating under basically private property rights and so on. So in that sense, you didn't have that, and the land has been allocated according, not to market forces any more than they are in London necessarily, but certainly with state planning and intervention, and not according to indigenous land rights. And that sets it apart from many other African countries where indigenous land rights are very important within the cities. The one exception, with us is why I said yes and no, is that in the sort of 2000s, with some of the land occupations, some of the farms around the edge of Harare were taken over, and that some of that land allocation and the way in which housing was built up on that, not in terms of indigenous tenure obviously, but there was a very different type of land allocation that did take into account things like, for example, war veterans and so on. But they've had a very patchy sort of long-term thing in which some of their land has actually been taken away again, for example, under operation around Masvingo, where the sort of planning regime paradigm came back in a very big way in the cities. So that's why I say yes and no, but essentially they are very different types of land tenure, so you're talking about very different things.
Next batch of 2 questions. My colleague over there, and Noel Lifton here. Yes, please.
It's a question for the 2 first speakers. I grew up in Zimbabwe. When I was 12, just to give a quick picture, I had students in class come to me and say they'd received letters that farms were being taken away, land was being redistributed. When I was 17, I was a hostel prefect. I had to comfort students who went home that weekend and their farms were taken over. People injured, almost killed, violent takeover, just a mini picture. I've never been opposed to the land redistribution. My concern is that as an intelligent man, Mugabe, we all know, is highly intelligent, highly educated. Was there no way, as we saw in Russia, that a 5-year plan could have been implemented to educate the farmers and the people taking over the land how to farm thousands of acres of land, what kind of crops are grown on soil like this? Now, for me, to What I'm concerned about is there was no planning, there was no structure, and it resulted in the downfall that we saw. Clearly, I know you say a lot of crops are farmed in Masvingo, fantastic, but maize is the staple food of Zimbabwe, and we saw a downfall in that. I put it down to lack of training, lack of planning, and the government losing support, and I believe that's why the land takeover happened when it did. My question today is, would we be seeing a different picture? Would the negativity around the land distribution be as it is today if there was proper planning, structuring, education? Another point that you made, sorry, the first speaker, you said that the new farmers were giving poor people an income. They were a livelihood basically. But these farmers had thousands of workers, they were educating them, had shops on the farms. They did have a livelihood. It just so happened that the farm owners were white. So, trying my best to look at it scientifically, but I can't ignore the fact that a 5-year plan could have affected the outcome today.
Chatham House. Thank you, Ian, for a fascinating and challenging presentation. You mentioned that in Masvingo province, only 5% of the beneficiaries were what you termed cronies. Forgive me if I missed it, but how much of the land did the cronies receive? And connected with that, insofar as support services, irrigation and so on, and new seeds were provided, and I'm not quite clear to what extent they were, did they tend to get, or did they not tend to get the lion's share of that?
Okay, support for the new farmers and a broad planning framework. I think you're right that what's needed now is a concerted effort to provide support for new farmers to get going. Many of the drops in production were, as you say, through the transition that occurred where people were carving out new land and trying to get going. Increasingly things are looking better, but they're not good. I mean, I don't want to give a completely positive spin on this. So yes, there is support, there is a need for support in a variety of ways. And this support is something that actually Zimbabwe in the past has done very well. I mean, the transition post-independence of the communal areas and that rapid growth in maize production that we saw in the 1980s was very much a result of concerted state effort in credit, in technical support, in irrigation and the rest. Zimbabwe can do it. How did white farming, so-called, get going in the 1950s, post-Second World War? By a substantial, sustained investment by the state in irrigation, in dam building, and so on. So, yes, successful farming, by and large, comes on the back of sustained support. And also entrepreneurial activity. Now, we've already demonstrated the fact there's lots of entrepreneurial activity. Some of that background support is certainly necessary and certainly has been lacking. I mean, a lack of seeds, fertilizer supply and so on, particularly in the period of severe economic crisis, it really hampered the rebounding of the agricultural economy. Fortunately, that's in a better shape now with consequent changes. Merle's question about land allocation to so-called cronies. Yes, of course, the total percentage of beneficiaries was about 5%. Most of those had relatively larger areas of land. So overall, the overall land area in our study sites was about, I think, 7.5%, 8% or thereabouts, which would be in that category. 80%? But it's still 7 to 8%. So they had relatively larger land, therefore it's a higher percentage, but not massively larger, because these were A2 farms, not that huge. Nowhere near the levels claimed sometimes in the media. Nowhere near. And that's important to get that balance right. Of course, there are people who have gained land through patronage and through political connections. There is no question about that. This is well known. And there are some, including in Zimbabwe, in Masvingo province, who have gained very large areas of land through that route, particularly in and around the 2008 elections. But it's not the major story. It's part of the story. It's an important part of the story for the broader political analysis of the consequences of this, but it's not the major part of the story overall. And we just have to get that balance right. In terms of input, supply, and so on, there were a variety of schemes run by Gideon Gono, who everyone knows is completely bonkers, manager of the Reserve Bank. And he came up with these random schemes for supplying inputs, which even the Russians probably wouldn't have done. And they were subject to extreme forms of corruption and ineffectiveness. But actually the people who got them didn't really that benefit from it, because very often they were grossly inappropriate, they were late, they were just poorly applied misspending of money. Fortunately that has now stopped, and Tendai Biti has rather firmer control on the fiscus as a result.
Robin, did you want to make a comment?
Just maybe one comment. We had a workshop in Masvingo in the middle of 2009. Before the workshop, they did a sensible thing. They took us around to meet some of the beneficiaries of the land reform program. And I read this afterwards. We visited a number of resettlement research sites in Masvingo. They were located on what had once been a huge single ranch owned by one white farmer employing a handful of workers. Now, significant numbers of black Zimbabweans were deriving livelihoods there from a wide mix of agricultural production. Their small farms were bursting with production of different grains, beans, etc. See photo below. Though marketing them was a problem. And they were part of what the researchers call a major transformation of agrarian structures and relations which had taken place in the province.
The gentleman here and then the gentleman here. We've got plenty of time, ladies and gentlemen. Be patient, please. But 1, 2, yes, please. Yeah.
Ivan Birini, I'm from Zimbabwe. I just want to pick up one of the critiques that you received about Masvingo not being representative. I don't know what that means, whether it's in terms of the weather or in terms of, in terms of the landscape or whatever. What I'm trying to say is you have to be more specific about what you mean by not being representative. It might be representative in this sense, that the sort of people I suspect who have resettled in this area are like the average land-hungry person. If you see what I mean, the ones that we think are deserving of getting land. Partly because Masvingo is one of the biggest provinces in terms of population, and the land, as you have said, is one that perhaps is of less interest to the cronies for the reasons of climate. But I think there's an important point here which he has mentioned, the importance of water. And I just wonder, looking forward, to what extent do you think this process of accumulation you have observed can we expect it to continue, or the limits are quite close, given the water problem in this province, which I think is really big. After all, I think historically, Hutu is one of the areas which is highly populated. Actually, even in the revision era, they moved people from those districts because it was too densely populated. So I think these are issues. I haven't read the book, so I don't know. But I just wonder, this water constraint, what extent it will be a problem.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Samuel. I'm from the Zimbabwe community. My question is direct to Robin. You are saying there is now people want to engage into a debate about the land. People are getting interested in that debate. And I'm saying, could it be that this is a debate which started in the 1990s, but the CFU did not actually lost an opportunity to deal with it, because I think that time the CFU wanted to negotiate the land issue on their terms. And I remember going to one conference where one of the ministers was told to be, waffling after saying that we need to deal with the land issue because this is why Zimbabwe went to war. And I actually, as a person from the opposition, I actually blame the CFU for having created an opportunity which gave Mugabe an opportunity to do all these problems, because if they decided to talk to Mugabe, and they were there in the State House so many times, but they wanted to negotiate on their own terms.
Maybe we start with Robert, again a short break, and then come to Ian as a second respondent.
There's lots of if-onlys in the Zimbabwean land reform histories. If only something had happened in 1980, etc., etc. Miles Tendi, who isn't here tonight, has written a very interesting article, soon to be published, I hope, in African Affairs, where he says one of the reasons why things didn't happen much in around 1990 was because the Commonwealth was very concerned about the transition to change in South Africa. And they didn't want any radical land reform happening in Zimbabwe around that time, because that would rock the boat in South Africa. It's an interesting perspective. One of those things that nobody can probably prove or disprove. It's an interesting thought. CFU, I mean, I read somewhere that white farmers were regarded as a rather protected species after 1980. It was a very kind of curious state of affairs. And I think they lost a wonderful opportunity to be proactive about land reform. If instead of sitting back and thinking, oh God, thank God, the war's over, we can just go back to life as we know it and love it. If they had been genuinely proactive, I mean, some individuals were certainly, but I mean, as an organisation, both, particularly I think in the first decade, but even in the second decade after independence, I think that could have made a significant difference. And there were kind of, well, you know this, there were various kind of deals with the World Bank and so forth, this and that donor conference, this might have happened, but it didn't. So it's lots of lost opportunities there, and it's. I've read recently some white farmers' sort of memoirs, and partly it comes through this book, Whiteness in Zimbabwe as well. Whites love the landscape. White farmers love the landscape. I'm crudely generalising. White farmers love the landscape, but they didn't actually see the people there as people. And that's a tragedy, I think. And it's rather different, perhaps. Maybe Joe's got a comment in Mozambique. I think maybe there's a difference there. It was an interesting thesis by Angus Selby, available on the Oxfam Land Rights in Africa website, which I still manage, even though I no longer work for Oxfam. It's a good thesis. It's about the CFU and their history.
Lost opportunities. I think there were many. And 1998, which Robin mentioned, was the last of them, and could have been the last-ditch attempt to rescue something from that debate. But as Angus documents in his thesis, the CFU had fractured. We had, JAG had formed. There were different debates within the CFU. It was no longer what it had been, a coherent, effective, organised grouping. So, as a result, the influence on the policy processes at that time were very, very fragmented. And that, I think, was the big tragedy of the failure of the CFU, or the communities associated with the CFU, to engage with that debate. I'm glad that in the Zimbabwean they're claiming that they want to re-engage with the debate. I mean, I think it's important. There are again the two factions, the JAG group and the core CFU. The JAG group are insistent on pursuing the legal redress routes through the SADC tribunal and the rest. Whereas there are other groups in the CFU who are saying, well, you know, to some extent we did miss our opportunities, and this has happened. We've got to find ways of re-engaging. And I think there are multiple ways, and I've had some very good and positive discussions with colleagues in the CFU, particularly the younger ones, about how the skills and the capacities of the former white farming community can re-engage with the new situation. Not necessarily through owning land, or even necessarily even leasing land, which is increasing, as you may know, but through engaging with this broader agricultural sector. And indeed, many people, certainly in Masvingo province, are already doing this. People lost their land, or lost most of their land, but they also had transport businesses, import-export businesses, support for irrigation systems, consultancy advice, input supply systems, marketing arrangements, and so on. There's a whole range of things you can do in agriculture or in rural areas, in rural economies, that don't necessarily involve owning land. And this is, you know, one of the things that is very difficult for some people in this community because of that deep association with land and landscape without people. They cannot get used to the idea that their farms, our farms, are now populated by different people. Of course, they were populated by different people before, but are now populated by different people again. Well, their ancestors were before. So, yeah, it's a complicated issue, and I hope that there can be some re-engagement. It's not easy, partly because of the political positioning of the white community associated with political parties, and that's not been made it easier. But as this debate unfolds, I think compromises and new ways of thinking will occur. Sorry, too long. Water. I mean, as Simona has said, water and land, certainly in the drier areas, have to go together. Land reform and water reform have to be part of the same picture. You can't take land without water in dry land areas, simple as that. And you know, as white farmers found very quickly, when they took land under colonisation, they quickly had to invest in getting hold of water, extracting water, deep wells, dams and the rest. That's going to have to be part and parcel of the rebuilding of land. But water will be scattered in a different way to what it was before. The watered landscape of Zimbabwe will look very different. It will mean very different investments to the conventional investments that we've seen before. Small water rather than big water, to use a colleague's term. But in that Zimbabwean and Rhodesian mentality that seems to persist no matter what happens in the country around planning and around investment in big ideas, what are we talking about now? Still the Bulawayo pipeline, still the Tokwe Mkosi Dam, still these big infrastructural investments which have become part and parcel of the mythology of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was created around the dams and the Zambezi Valley and so on and so forth. And those are not going to be the appropriate forms of investment in infrastructure for the new situation. They simply aren't. But the danger is that they will get the finance. They're nice things for donors to fund as soon as some political settlement happens at some point. Oh, well, we'll fund a big dam. The World Bank will give a massive great grant. Off it will go. And that will restructure both the availability of water and with that the availability of land. And it is already happening. Chinese investment, investment by Billy Reichenbach and his comrades in the Low Veld. This is transforming the way that land is thought about and used in those areas through the medium of water. And getting access to water, and Billy knows this very well, getting access to water in that old DTZ land is going to be key to his empire building in that part of the country.
Let's Simona have a chance.
Yeah, I think maybe Ian has comment on the issue of water. I think given the history of Zimbabwe, if people are aware of what went on with the land, I think Robert Palmer's book is quite critical because it shows that earlier in the 1890s, out of the 1950s, and I think it shows that most of the land that was taken was where there was enough water. Bulawayo, the Shangani and Bulawayo reserves were in dry areas. The Bulawayo High Road where water was taken. And also, you look at the High Road, the Region 1 and Region 2, that's where water was. Masvingo then plays a different development in the sense that there was no water, there isn't much water in Masvingo province, that's rate of 4.5, but there's a large investment in terms education schemes. That's where you go to, particularly in the Zinda district, that's where you get into the triangle states. There was massive in water, in water infrastructure. Therefore, I think going forward, there's need to rethink to what extent can land form be linked to total form. You can't take the one without the other. And also, I think, therefore, to say Masvingo is different. Yes, in terms of water, access to water, but in terms of commercial viability, it's a different thing. If you focus on water alone, then you miss the point. The issue of wildlife management, there are different sets of business that commercial farmer needs to do. So if you say water in particular, then it is the other point. It's a much broader conception of commercial farming. It was wildlife. That's why you go to National Park and other conserved areas. So it's not only water for agriculture and for irrigating, but also water for land for other purposes. So I think maybe what we need to do is first of all link the issue between land and water reforms. Maybe that's what needs to be done going forward. But also when you look at regions, you need to look at different potentials for agriculture, for commercial activity, and therefore try to come with a strategy going forward. So I think that's my preference.
What about water? In the last 2 or 3 years, I've been reading a lot, writing a bit about what I call global land grabbing, and it's a huge issue, it's a very serious issue. People need to know about it, which is why I've been producing some bibliographies and so forth. But often, global land grabbing is actually global water grabbing. And because water, for all kinds of reasons, is a critical issue, and with climate change and so forth, there are big struggles for access to water, particularly in our valley, but in other places.
Because of the political constraints and because of the need for immediate action on the land, which obviously couldn't be controlled, and for other reasons as well, which I won't go into. But one thing which I do want to ask about is that expertise which was considerable at that stage, and which identified what needed to be done and in what order, presumably the people who were there and who knew all this and were in the ministry and in the extension service, they're still there. They know what needs to be done. Are they given much of a chance to put it into effect? I mean, this is one of the things. The way you were describing, Ian, in this fascinating account, and I look forward to reading your book, it sounds as though the farmers, the people who've been lucky enough to be given the various plots, have landed on it and have then been left to their own resources and have had to find such investment as they can from their own resources. Is this what's happened, or has there been any form of government extension service advice, expertise offered, as well as the provision of training, of assisting in marketing, all the kind of things which are really needed before the agricultural sector will be able to function properly? Obviously, with everything happening at once, it was never going to be possible for it to be smooth at the same time as if it had been done over a number of years. But at least there should be some sort of effort, particularly in a province such as Masvingo, I have thought.
I had a female colleague at the back here.
Yes,
it was you.
Hello, I'm Diana Jeter. I'm interested in what happened in 2008. Partly because I'm currently trying to do some work on political violence, and partly because of endlessly writing reports for asylum seekers. So I've got a sort of threefold question. The first is, having been resettled on this land, has this encouraged people to feel enthusiastically in support of ZANU? Or has being given resettled land not make a significant difference to the choices that people make about how to vote? Secondly, during 2008, were your research areas places which were deemed, as it were, to have been places that should have voted ZANU? And were they therefore subject to higher levels of political violence in places where they didn't do so? On the basis that the general pattern seems to be that the political violence was primarily directed against places that were seen as being places that ought to have voted ZANU and didn't. And thirdly, insofar as there was political violence, were your farmers actually involved in it? Was this local people mobilising against other people in their community that they saw as a threat to what they'd gained? Or was it seen as something that came from outside?
Gentleman here. My name is Bafo Akoma, editor of New African Magazine. I have a short question as a follow-up of this lady's question about cronies. Ian, after your book came out, I have read your book. 2 weeks after your book came out, Africa Confidential reported that Mugabe does have 14 farms, and Mamujulu and her husband have 25 farms. Mugabe plus his family are supposed to have 33,000 hectares. You did a 10-year study. Did you ever come across any of these farms? And if you did, why did you not report it in your book?
Okay. So we have 3 questions, yeah? Do you have more? Right.
This is going to be it, so you wrote a summary of it as well.
Well, expertise and rebuilding. There is a huge amount of expertise in Zimbabwe. I mean, some of it has moved abroad into the diaspora, but actually still within the Zimbabwean context, there's a huge amount of expertise. I was mentioning our colleagues in Agritech in Masvingo province. But government, in the functioning of the technocratic arms of government in the last decade has been virtually zero. Salaries have dropped off to pittances, and recurrent costs, fuel, keeping vehicles going, etc., has collapsed. So the collapse of the ability of the state to be able to service its population, as a consequence of this economic and political crisis, has had a huge impact, despite the fact that the expertise is around. Now, the good thing is, unlike some other countries that have been through conflict and phases like this, the rebuilding can be quite rapid, I believe. But it will require money. And Tendai Beta doesn't have much of it at the moment, and donor support is very sporadic and is not available because of the ongoing political discussions, and certainly not available to the so-called contested lands. So there is no support. So people have to do it themselves. And it's remarkable how much people can do themselves through their own networks, through their own capacities and their own ingenuity. But I don't want to make the case, and we don't in the book, that sort of a voluntaristic, let's all do it by ourselves type of thing can solve the problem. It requires sustained state support in the longer term, and hopefully in the longer term, donors, NGOs and others will come in to back that. Yeah.
After the donors conference, I was one of a team of so-called experts to go and advise Defeat Zimbabwe about what to do. And we came up with a brilliant idea. Why don't you buy land? This might help. And I think people in Defeat Harare thought that was a good idea, but I'm pretty sure it got shot down here in London because that would be politically too difficult.
I have a slightly different perspective.
Okay.
Discuss over drink. Diana's question about political violence in 2008. As everybody knows, this was the bottom of Zimbabwe's experience, both in terms of political violence, economic catastrophe, and the rest. 2008. In our areas, it existed. It was sporadic. It was actually very difficult to trace how and why and in what setting. I mean, as you were intimating in your third point, often it was people from outside working with some local people, often associated with local vendettas that were nothing to do with the broader political questions that were being talked about. Very often, as in other examples, a period where authority declines and violence becomes more accepted, other disputes were settled. In our areas, there was quite a mix between so-called MDC areas and ZANU-PF areas. But Masvingo, as you know, is a complicated place because of the nature of both the MDC formations and the ZANU-PF formations in the province. So politics are played out in quite a different type of way. Those who got land, I think, were not necessarily all ZANU-PF supporters, although very often, and certainly in that period, had to claim to be such. Most people have one card here and another card there. I mean, that's what you do. And how people voted in the actual ballot is reflected in the election results, which are quite mixed in Masvingo, which gave everyone quite a surprise. The question of these large land grabs by very senior political officials. These are fairly well documented. Indeed, there's been a variety of these published. They're distributed in different parts of the country, and not surprisingly, the Mugabe clan ones are in the northern areas, and some of the Majuru ones are included in some parts of Masvingo and elsewhere. There are a few in nearby our study areas that are of this type, but not many. And this is a reflection of this wider debate about where these other larger land grabs took place. They're quite sporadic, they're quite focused, and even the government figures show there are so-called, this category that they've created called large A2 farms, which range between 500 hectares and up to 3,000. This is this category. There are 251 of them listed in government, in the ministry's figures. Urban Rail has the list. They're notionally all individually owned by separate people, but that's sometimes hiding multiple ownership, as is well known. Which is why the contentions around the land audit remain. The land audit is meant to address some of these irregularities. So yes, they do exist, there is no question. But they exist alongside this other picture, which is important to bear in mind.
Ladies and gentlemen, this evening was configured to have three parts. The first part was Ian, on behalf of himself and his colleague authors, discoursing on the book and its findings. The second part was the panel discussion, which you all then played your own role in making this part of the evening as enlivening as possible. The third part is when we now break into an informal, more sort of mixed session where we can discuss these things casually, informally, over a drink or two. Before we break to do that, I think you would all want to join with me in thanking not only yourselves for your candid questions and interventions, particularly the panelists and Professor Scoones as the primary author, for the great frankness and the great sort of honesty that they have brought to this discussions this evening. And I think that all of us would agree, no matter what our position on the land issue might be, that the role of good academic work is to make us think. And I think that what this book has done is certainly to have put in a great deal of new thinking and to catalyze, I think, a great deal more thinking on this very, very complex issue. Please join with me in thanking the panel and thanking you. Don't forget to buy the book.